welcome. I'm James Azimoha and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. Iran and Israel say they have halted strikes following a day of military escalation. Russia has launched fresh attacks on Ukrainian cities, killing civilians in Zaporizhia and the Kharkiv region. And the United Nations says the closure of Gaza's main entry points is worsening the humanitarian situation in the Strip. Iran and Israel say they have halted attacks against each other after a day of sharp escalation raised fears of a wider conflict. The pause followed calls from U.S. President Donald Trump, although both sides are warning they could resume military action if the other strikes again.
Iran and Israel have announced a halt to attacks following nearly 24 hours of direct military confrontation. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters said on Monday that it was suspending strikes against Israel after what it described as a response to Israeli military actions in Lebanon. The statement warned that any further Israeli attacks would trigger a much stronger reaction. Israeli media, citing a senior official, reported that Israel also suspended its strikes on Iran at the request of U.S. President Donald Trump. However, the official said Israel would continue high-intensity operations against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and could expand strikes if attacks on Israeli territory continue. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the fighting with Iran was currently on hold, but warned that Israel would retaliate if Iran launched further attacks.
After Iran attacked Israel, I instructed the IDF to strike military and economic targets throughout Iran. We did that as well. At the moment, the fire has ceased, because after we struck the terrorist regime in Tehran, it stopped attacking us. If the terrorist regime makes the mistake of attacking us again, we will respond with force. Because Israel has the full right to self-defense, and we exercise it whenever necessary. I say this to you, dear citizens of Israel, just as I say it with appreciation and respect in my good conversations with my friend, President Trump.
The latest crisis began on Sunday evening when Iran launched ballistic missiles at northern Israel, saying the attack was retaliation for Israeli military operations in southern Lebanon. Iran carried out further strikes on Monday, targeting military sites and industries. Israel responded with airstrikes on military targets in Iran, including air defense systems, saying the operation was aimed at reducing threats to Israeli security. The exchange marked the most serious direct confrontation between the two countries since a ceasefire was reached in April.
Tensions between Iran and the European Union are rising over the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has rejected a new round of EU sanctions, accusing European governments of double standards and defending what it says are its sovereign rights in the strategic waterway. Turaj Shivelido has more.
The Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister for Legal Affairs, Kazem Garibabadi, has strongly condemned the move by the Council of European Union to sanction Iranian individuals and an entity in relation with the Strait of Hormuz, linking the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. In a post on the platform X, he stressed that Iran does not attach any value to the political and hypocritical move and will continue its strategy of maintaining sovereignty and exercising sovereign rights over the Strait of Hormuz. His statement was made after the European bloc imposed on Monday sanctions on a Revolutionary Guards Navy unit and 2 Iranian individuals, accusing them of supporting measures that restrict navigation through the maritime corridor. Garibabadi branded the European states as major violators of the Iranian people's rights because of their deliberate silence regarding the U.S. naval blockade of the Iranian southern ports, which he termed an act of war. Addressing the legal status of the crucial global shipping lanes, the senior Iranian diplomat reminded that Tehran is not a party to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. According to the Iranian official, the legal regime emphasized by Iran in the Strait of Hormuz is innocent passage based on customary international law and observance of the coastal state's maritime safety and security considerations. Innocent passage is a concept in law of the sea that allows vessels to pass through the territorial sea of another state, subject to certain restrictions. It applies to the entire territorial sea up to at most 12 nautical miles from coastal baseline. Refuting the move by the European Union's legislative body, the Iranian official also noted that unilateral coercive measures do not create law. Rather, they can be the source of international responsibility for their authors. The U.S. blockade of Iran's ports and Tehran's grip over the Strait of Hormuz have created a gridlock that is neither peace nor raging conflict, as has been the case in weeks of trading attacks between the Iranian and U.S. militaries amid a fragile ceasefire. The standoff has also endangered the energy security of the European countries already facing backlashes of the Russia-Ukraine war. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Now, the United Nations says the closure of Gaza's main entry points is worsening the humanitarian situation and is urging Israel to reopen them without delay. UN officials say the organization rejects the restriction and continues to call for unrestricted humanitarian access.
OCHA reports that following missile attacks towards Israel since last night, the Israeli authorities closed the Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salam crossing today, which has been the only crossing into Gaza that had been operational for cargo over the past 2 weeks. However, humanitarians were allowed to collect cargo from the Palestinian side of the crossing. Israeli authorities also closed Rafah crossing. OCHA stressed that people in the Gaza Strip rely on a steady flow of humanitarian and commercial goods from outside. The UN and our humanitarian partners work hard to maintain a sustained and predictable flow of supplies despite restrictions. Such efforts cannot be sustained if crossings remain closed. Against this backdrop, civilians and civilian infrastructure continue to be exposed to Israeli airstrikes, shelling, and gunfire, resulting in reported casualties and damage. Under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected.
Russia has launched fresh attacks on Ukrainian cities, killing civilians in Zaporizhia and the Kharkiv region. The strikes come as Ukraine targets Russian oil facilities. Meantime, the European Union is preparing a new round of sanctions against Moscow.
A Russian drone attack on Ukraine's southeastern city of Zaporizhia has killed 2 people and wounded 23 others, according to regional governor Ivan Fedorov. The strike hit near a bus station, damaging vehicles, shops and nearby structures. Forensic teams worked at the scene, where authorities also recovered a damaged object believed to be part of a drone. Russian forces also targeted the Kharkiv region, where officials said 4 people were killed and more than 20 injured in missile and drone strikes on Tuesday. The attacks came as Ukraine intensified strikes on oil facilities in Russia, part of Kyiv's campaign to raise the economic cost of Moscow's war. Russian authorities have reported fuel supply problems in several southern regions following the strikes. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov acknowledged certain problems, but said measures were being taken, while blaming panic buying. Diplomatic contacts also remain on the agenda. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Roman Abramovich had acted as a go-between for messages between Kyiv and Moscow. At the same time, the European Union is preparing a new round of sanctions against Russia. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said the proposed measures include 18 new listings targeting Russia's military-industrial complex, human rights violators and propagandists.
The European Commission is preparing its 21st package of sanctions against Russia, targeting key sectors including energy, banking and the fishing industry. The measures are intended to increase pressure on Russia's war effort in Ukraine. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said existing sanctions are already having a significant impact on the Russian economy.
Today we are putting forward the 21st sanctions package. We focus on the sectors with the highest impact, that is energy, It is financial services and crypto, trade, and this time it includes for the very first time fisheries. And we are banning the entry of former Russian combatants into the European Union.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in Estonia for the Ukraine Nordic-Baltic summit. Zelenskyy met with Estonian President Alar Karis before joining the broader regional summit later this afternoon. During a news conference, Ukrainian President said that Europe needs a strong voice in peace talks. Ahead of the main event, Zelenskyy also held separate bilateral talks in Tallinn with the prime ministers of Finland, Latvia and Sweden. The president's spokesperson confirmed that discussions focused on regional security. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping is in North Korea for his first visit to the country in 7 years, holding talks with leader Kim Jong-un aimed at strengthening bilateral ties and expanding strategic cooperation. Xi called for closer coordination between Beijing and Pyongyang as the two leaders pledged to strengthen bilateral ties. The talks come as China seeks to reinforce its influence in North Korea amid Pyongyang's growing partnership with Russia, which has deepened through military and economic cooperation in recent years. Now, the United States has added several major Chinese companies, including Alibaba, BYD, and Baidu, to a Pentagon blacklist over alleged military ties, a move Beijing has condemned as discriminatory and coming just weeks after a landmark Trump-Xi summit. Our correspondent has more from Beijing.
The U.S. Department of Defense has designated dozens of Chinese firms as Chinese military companies, among them technology giant Alibaba, electric vehicle maker BYD, and search engine Baidu. Washington says that the three companies are affiliated with China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which oversees the country's technology and industrial policies. The updated list now includes 188 firms, up from 134 previously. Companies on the list will be barred from consideration for U.S. defense contracts under rules set to take effect later this month. Alibaba has rejected the designation, saying there is no basis for its inclusion and has vowed to take legal action. China's embassy in Washington has condemned the move as discriminatory. The expansion comes less than a month after President Trump met Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing for a two-day summit aimed at easing trade and technology tensions between the two countries. Manir Makhtoom, A News, Beijing.
Now, France's parliament has recognized state responsibility over the use of a banned pesticide in its Caribbean territories. The decision relates to long-term environmental and health damage in the Martinique and Guadeloupe Islands.
France's parliament has formally recognized state responsibility for the use of the pesticide chlordecone in its overseas territories of Martinique and Guadeloupe. The decision follows decades of concerns over environmental and health impacts linked to the chemical, which was used on banana plantations between the 1970s and early 1990s, despite earlier restrictions in mainland France. Chlordecone, a highly toxic insecticide, was later banned globally under the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Studies by health authorities, including France's National Agency for Health Security, have linked long-term exposure to the substance with serious contamination of soil and water, as well as increased cancer risks, particularly prostate cancer.
Unfortunately, this prohibition didn't apply to French overseas territories, where the use of chlordecone continued until 1993. Particularly on banana plantations in Guadeloupe and Martinique, which led to tragic and serious health consequences of local population.
The new law does not immediately establish full compensation, but it sets out a framework for further investigation and possible reparations. A government inspection mission is expected to visit both territories to assess damage and propose compensation mechanisms.
In this regard, the Baku Initiative Group has successfully conducted events dedicated to this issue. Also, we submitted reports dedicated to environmental consequences of colonialism to the international organizations. For example, during the COP29 in 2024, we successfully delivered this issue to the global community through conducted events dedicated to this matter. And today we can see a real impact of work done by Baku Initiative Group through the adopted legislation by the French Parliament.
Officials have acknowledged that earlier warnings about the chemicals' risks were not adequately acted upon at the time. However, the scale and form of compensation remain under discussion.
Now, a court ruling in France is drawing renewed attention to New Caledonia's independence movement and the relationship between Paris and its overseas territories. The decision comes after a lengthy and closely watched legal case that has sparked debate over justice, political activism, and the legal legacy of colonial rule.
For nearly 2 years, Kanak pro-independence leader Christian Taine faced criminal charges that took him thousands of kilometres from his home in New Caledonia and placed him at the centre of one of France's most closely watched investigations. Now, a Paris court has thrown out the case against Taine and 13 others, citing insufficient evidence, fueling debate over how France applies the democratic standards it promotes abroad. The case stemmed from the May 2024 unrest in New Caledonia, which began over proposed changes to voter eligibility rules. The protests later turned violent, leaving 14 people dead and prompting France to declare a state of emergency, deploy security forces, and transfer dozens of detained Kanaks to mainland France. At the time, Taine led the Field Action Coordinating Group, known as CCAT, which had been created by a pro-independence party. Prosecutors alleged that the group operated as an organised structure seeking to destabilise New Caledonia's public services, administration and economy. The case included serious allegations linked to complicity in attempted murder, destruction of property and armed theft. However, the court found no concrete evidence that Taine had coordinated violence, including through secret contacts, messages or phone calls. This made the length of the process central to the controversy. If the core accusations could not be proven, why did the investigation last 576 days? Critics argue that a long investigation, detention far from home, and public accusations can become a form of pressure even without a conviction, especially when directed at a leading pro-independence figure. That makes Taine's case more than a criminal proceeding. It is also tied to France's handling of independence demands in its overseas territories. Critics argue that France can present itself as a defender of democratic values, while using legal and administrative tools to pressure pro-independence movements in its overseas territories. In that view, the Taine case is not only about a failed prosecution, but about how political pressure can be exercised through the language of law. In media interviews, Taine described his detention as deeply damaging, saying a year in solitary confinement was very, very hard. His lawyers called the original procedure an attempt to silence a politician. New Caledonia, also known as Kanaki, has been under French rule since 1853 and remains on the UN list of non-self-governing territories, where independence demands have long shaped politics. That makes investigations against pro-independence leaders politically sensitive. For that reason, the case is also seen as a test of France's approach to its colonial legacy.
A planned U.S. Ebola quarantine facility in Kenya has become the center of growing controversy triggering protests, legal challenges and debate over public health and national sovereignty. Here's more.
Police in Kenya fired tear gas and detained several protesters on Tuesday as opposition continued to grow over a U.S.-backed Ebola quarantine center near the town of Nanyuki. Many residents opposed the project, arguing that Kenya should not bear the risks linked to an Ebola outbreak affecting parts of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Moreover, tensions over the plan escalated last week, leading to the deaths of 2 protesters.
Is that correct?
The center is being built at Laikipia Air Base near Nanyuki. It would be able to accommodate up to 50 people. U.S. officials say it is intended for Americans who have been exposed to Ebola but are not showing symptoms. Anyone who develops symptoms would be transferred elsewhere for treatment. The project has also sparked a legal dispute. A Kenyan High Court judge has twice ordered the government to halt construction and operations at the site. Lawyers challenging the plan say the government failed to meet the latest court deadline. However, President William Ruto has defended the project, saying last week that his administration is doing the right thing. The United States says it is aware of the court challenge and is working with Kenyan authorities to address concerns. Washington has also pledged $13.5 million to support Kenya's Ebola preparedness efforts. The facility is being planned as Ebola cases continue to rise in eastern Congo and Uganda, where more than 500 infections and over 100 deaths have been reported since the outbreak was declared last month. U.S. military aircraft have continued bringing personnel and equipment to the site despite court orders aimed at stopping the project, with additional temporary structures appearing at the airbase. Kenyan officials say the center could also serve Kenyan and foreign nationals, although U.S. authorities have not confirmed that.
All right, after the break, we'll look at the growing differences within Europe over how the war in Ukraine should end as President Zelenskyy meets Baltic and Nordic leaders in Estonia. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Way News. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has met the leaders of the Baltic and Nordic countries in Estonia amid renewed debate over Europe's strategy towards the war in Ukraine. Join us now to discuss this is Daniela Mello, political scientist, joining us from Boston. Good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Kai Kallas says countries with direct experience of Russia must help shape any future negotiations. Is this really a debate about Ukraine or about who gets to define Europe's security future?
It's both things. Increasingly, the Europeans have come to understand that the future of Ukraine can be a determinant of the future of European defense. When Ukraine started this, when Ukraine entered this conflict, it didn't start it. When Russia invaded Ukraine over 4 years ago, the Europeans were uncertain initially what their role ought to be, but as the situation continued to evolve, and as the United States and the European Union and the NATO members came to butt heads over what the correct strategy ought to be, clarity has become one of the wins in certain ways for Zelenskyy. Why? Zelenskyy has been making the argument to the Europeans, to NATO, since day one, that if Russia was able to be successful at this aggression, then all of Europe, all of NATO could be at risk. The Europeans seem to finally have taken this quite seriously, and even though there are news this week of some potential disagreements over who got to be at the table yesterday and today, and we know that EU members and NATO members are plenty. There's plenty of time to bring everyone into the table. But of course, including the countries that have the most direct experience with Russia in shaping the discussion about the future of European defense, the future of Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's defense, and whether that future includes probably not NATO, but a membership in the European Union is still on the table for Zelenskyy, for the Ukraine. Ukrainians in the future. So it is crucial that the Baltic states, that Poland, that they get a seat at the table, and the Europeans are aware of that. So as of now, I believe that talks about tensions about the Polish and the Italians not being at the meeting in London, for instance, may be a bit overblown, because Europeans are well aware that this is a coordinated effort.
Now, between recent battlefield gains and ongoing strikes on foreign oil infrastructure, is Kyiv trying to maximize its leverage before negotiations begin?
Well, I think undoubtedly Kyiv is trying to go into or create an opening for negotiations when it feels that it has an advantage on the field. That's also what Russia tried to do last year when it felt that it was winning, that it was pressuring the Ukrainians. That's when it showed itself most open to maintain discussions with the Ukrainians through the Americans. Now, we know that those discussions didn't get anywhere, in part because Russia continued to make the same maximalist demands that it made at the beginning of the conflict, thus leaving no room for real negotiation with the Ukrainians that could bring to a ceasefire. Now the tables have inverted, and the tables are inverted in great part, because of the Ukrainian military effort and its continuous adaptation, the gains that it made over the past month. In May, Russia actually had a net loss of territory. Some numbers are pointing towards over 30,000 lives lost per month in the Russian side. So the momentum this summer seems to be on the side of Zelenskyy, and he obviously wants to take advantage of that by pressuring Putin very openly. I mean, sending an open letter to Putin that defies Putin and invites him to the negotiation table face to face, not through intermediaries, but that also leaves out the United States as a mediator and seems to create more room for the Europeans to take that role, if not as direct mediators, at least as individuals who are sitting at the table, who are being informed of every step of the negotiations, and who are themselves giving leverage to Zelenskyy in these negotiations. Zelenskyy is in a stronger position, and he's trying to take advantage of that to get better terms at any negotiation for a ceasefire. Whether or not Putin is going to take him on, that seems increasingly unlikely, because in fact Putin is reacting to a lot of these losses. We're seeing images of explosions as we speak, but Putin is taking advantage of this moment to basically escalate. This escalation through airstrikes has been deadly to the Ukrainians. I mean, we've all been seeing the images coming out of Ukraine over the past few weeks, but it's widely interpreted as a signal of the weakness on the ground of the Russian troops. So it seems clear that Putin is trying to make up for the weaknesses, for the strategic weaknesses on the ground and for the losses on the ground by causing this type of damage and trying to increase the pressure on the Ukrainians. But most analysts are reading this as, in fact, a sign of Russian weakness.
Now, finally, what should we watch most closely after this summit? Developments on the battlefield or developments within Europe itself?
We need to look for a number of things. We need to look for the type of support that the Europeans continue to give to the Ukrainians. That does not seem to be at risk to me. In fact, we're seeing more European sanctions. We are seeing more European coordination in trying to help Ukraine. We're seeing an investment in Europe on its own security, but as an extension of that, on the security of Ukraine in trying to build up its its armament capacity independence from the United States. That, of course, is going to take a long time, but the Europeans seem to be very focused on maintaining a coherent front when it comes to support for Ukraine. And that support has been absolutely essential, especially since President Donald Trump came to power, because as we know, President Donald Trump last year really subscribed to the vision that Zelenskyy didn't have any cards. That's the now very famous line that we quote about that meeting between Zelenskyy and President Trump last February of last year, I mean. But in fact, Zelenskyy has shown that the Ukrainians can be very innovative, and they do have a lot of cards up their sleeve, and in ways that are not an exact parallel with what's happening in Iran. But Ukraine has shown us that the face of war has changed, that in fact, just having the larger territory and the most soldiers and the most weapons is not enough to be able to completely conquer another state, especially if that smaller state is willing and able to adapt and to fight for its sovereignty. So we need to look for whether or not the Americans decide to also intervene once again in this type of negotiations. I think that the signals coming out of the Trump administration are strong that they may not seek once again to continue the mediator role that they were trying to play last year. And the person who seems to be most engaged with foreign policy in regards to Ukraine right now is Marco Rubio. And that itself may be a good sign for the Ukrainians, because Marco Rubio is known for being a hawk that is very suspicious of Russia's growth and Russia's power and Russia's balance of power with the Europeans, and sees a strategic value in not ceding that ground to Russia. Even as we know, there's also doubts within the Trump administration about whether or not NATO has the same value that it had in the past. But Marco Rubio is certainly someone who sees the value of NATO and sees the value of NATO as a balancing force to Russia. So Zelenskyy does have a far more favorable ground ahead of him this summer than he did in the past couple of years. Of course, we're talking about multidimensional chess, so a lot can change depending on how players make their moves. But Russia is in a weaker position. Right. Of that, there is no doubt.
All right, Daniela, thank you very much for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Stay with us. Welcome back to Our News. Now, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Venezuela's interim president Delcy Rodriguez held talks in Istanbul on Monday. Rodriguez visited Istanbul while returning from a visit in India, marking the first meeting between the two sides. No immediate details about the discussions were released. Rodriguez, who previously served as vice president, has been seeking to attract investment in Venezuela's oil and mining sectors as she works to stabilize the country following the capture of President Nicolas Maduro by U.S. forces. Now, by hosting Venezuelan acting president in Istanbul, President Erdogan seeks to deepen cooperation between the two countries in the fields of trade, energy and mining. The talks come as Ankara looks to expand its economic and diplomatic engagement in Latin American countries. Our correspondent Adam Moro has more.
Turkey and Venezuela are looking to strengthen their growing partnership, following talks in Istanbul between President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. Rodriguez, who was visiting Turkey at Erdogan's invitation, was greeted with a formal welcoming ceremony before the two sides held bilateral and delegation-level discussions. According to Turkish officials, Erdogan reaffirmed Turkey's support for what he described as the friendly people of Venezuela, stressing Ankara's commitment to expanding cooperation across a range of fields. Particular emphasis was placed on trade, energy, and mining, areas that have emerged as key pillars of the bilateral relationship in recent years. The two sides also discussed their shared target of achieving bilateral trade volumes of $3 billion annually. Several top Turkish officials attended the meeting, including Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, Energy Minister Alp Arslan Bayraktar, and Trade Minister Ömer Bolat. Relations between Ankara and Caracas have expanded significantly over the past decade, driven by growing cooperation in trade, energy, and investment. Turkey has become an important commercial partner for Venezuela at a time when the oil-rich South American nation has sought to diversify its international economic relationships. The two governments have maintained close political dialogue, with Erdogan and former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro holding frequent contacts and supporting efforts to deepen economic ties. Monday's talks served to underscore Ankara's broader strategy of expanding relations with partners outside its immediate neighborhood. They also highlighted Venezuela's interest in attracting new opportunities for cooperation, especially in the trade, investment, and energy fields, amid ongoing economic challenges. This is Adam Maro for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
The United Nations Security Council has held a meeting on Afghanistan focusing on UNAMA's mandate, women's rights and humanitarian concerns, regional tensions, and the country's political and economic situation. The meeting also heard calls for continued engagement with the Afghan authorities, while stressing that such engagement does not mean recognition of the current government. Our correspondent Tamim Bahiz has more.
The Security Council meeting on Afghanistan mainly focused on the extension of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, known as UNAMA, and the wider situation in the country. Senior UN officials told the Council that Afghanistan is currently free from large-scale armed conflict, but warned that the sustainability of peace will depend on the policies and structure of the Afghan authorities. UNAMA's acting chief, Georgette Gagnon, said engagement with the Afghan authorities remains important for monitoring developments in the country, but emphasized that this does not constitute recognition. The official also called for the removal of restrictions on women's education and employment, saying these measures have damaged Afghanistan's economy. The meeting also discussed the widespread return of migrants. According to the UN officials, around 5.9 million people have returned to Afghanistan since 2023, placing major pressure on the country's society, economy, and national capacities. Several countries also addressed the meeting, with Russia supporting the extension of UNAMA's mandate, China calling for girls' secondary schools to reopen and for women's access to education and work. India condemning Pakistan's airstrikes in Afghanistan as a violation of international law and sovereignty. And the United States urging stronger action on counter-terrorism concerns and closer review of UNAMA's mandate renewal. The meeting showed that the international community remains focused on Afghanistan's stability, women's rights, humanitarian needs, economic challenges, regional tensions, and the future role of the United Nations in the country. Tamim Bahiz in Kabul, A News.
Now, Kyrgyzstan is no longer on the European Union's aviation safety blacklist, ending restrictions that had been put in place since 2006. Officials in Bishkek say the move reflects years of reforms in civil aviation. More from our correspondent, Farza Kalamozina.
Kyrgyzstan has been removed from the European Union's aviation safety blacklist, ending nearly 2 decades of restrictions on the country's airlines. The decision was approved unanimously by all 27 EU member states, and according to authorities in Bishkek, all airlines certified in Kyrgyzstan have now been removed from the EU air safety list. For many people in Kyrgyzstan, the decision carries practical meaning. Since the ban was introduced in 2006, traveling to Europe often meant longer routes, extra costs and transit through neighboring countries, most commonly Kazakhstan. And many they see the decision as long-awaited news. The restrictions were introduced in 2006 when the European Commission banned 27 Kyrgyz passenger and cargo airlines from operating cross-EU airspace. Brussels said at the time that Kyrgyzstan's aviation oversight system did not meet international safety standards. Media reports at the time suggested that the decision may also have reflected a broader tightening of aviation safety measures in Europe following several international reviews and major air disasters, including the 2004 Flash Airlines crash near Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh, which killed 148 people, most of them French citizens. Officials in Bishkek say the country's removal from the blacklist follows years of reforms in civil aviation, including changes in safety regulation and oversight aimed at aligning Kyrgyzstan's aviation system with international requirements. Authorities now hope the decision will eventually open the door to new routes, stronger transport links with Europe, growth in international air travel, and an increase in tourism. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
All right, after the break, we'll examine growing concerns over Georgia's visa-free access to Europe as tensions between Tbilisi and Brussels continue to deepen. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now, Georgia's long-standing visa-free travel arrangements with the European Union is facing renewed scrutiny amid deteriorating relations between Tbilisi and Brussels. While ordinary Georgian citizens continue to enjoy visa-free access, debate is growing over whether wider measures could eventually be considered if current tensions persist. Let's talk to Dr. George Mchedishvili, Associate Professor at the European University, joining us from Tbilisi. Good to have you, sir.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, the EU insists this is about democratic standards, while Georgia argues the measures are politically motivated. What's your take?
Well, I think both of the sides have their reason and have the grain of truth. Unfortunately, over the past several years, the democratic credentials of Georgians have becoming more and more questionable with every passing election, with every passing law. They become increasingly draconian, and they are very legitimate concern on the part of European Union and Georgian partners about the pace of Georgian democracy. On the other hand, one can understand certain concerns of the Georgian authorities and their argument about certain complaints being politically motivated. They usually compare the current approach of the European Union to that of 10, 15, 17 years ago, when the other leadership was in Georgia, which was also very undemocratic, and it is believed that sometimes European authorities were turning a blind eye on certain violations of human rights, but they are very attentive and they are very critical of the current authorities, sometimes critical to a fault. So I believe that, well, in this particular regard, both sides could back down a little bit, but of course, first and foremost, the ball is on the court of the Georgian authorities, and they should take very serious measures to improve their democratic record.
Mm-hmm. Now, visa-free travel has long been one of the most tangible benefits of Georgia's relationship with Europe. However, how significant would it be in all spheres if that privilege came under broader threat?
So indeed, you correctly mentioned that has been probably the most tangible benefits of the EU-Georgia ties. So beyond symbolic, there were a possibility to travel to Europe because, it's part of our kind of, I would say, cultural code, being part of Europe. Obviously, politically, kind of Georgia has still a long way to go, but culturally, the practically entirety of the Georgian population waited for the through impatience, waited for the moments with such gusto, because for several hundred years, first we had curtailed independence, that we had about 200 years of the Russian domination, be it in the guise of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and finally, when the country regained its independence in 1991, so European dimension, European direction has become the predominant. So therefore, the proximity of the ties, the rapprochement between Georgia and European Union were being met in Georgia with enormous support, enormous cheering, and vice versa. Conversely, so the current stalled relations between Georgia and European Union is being met with consternation and disappointment. So let alone the possibility, people are hardwired in such a way that they get used to better things, to good things, very easily. So I myself recall the very humiliating experience of waiting for several hours in the line in the embassy, trying to get visa, and all of a sudden it is gone. So we really started to feel closer to Europe, significantly closer, not only on symbolic, but also on an institutional level. Now, the suspension of the travel, of course, it will be body blow for many Georgians.
Now, from Brussels' perspective, what do they really want from the Georgian government?
Particularly over the past several years, questionable elections, 2024 parliamentary election, a number of very undemocratic laws, legislation pieces adopted by the Georgian parliament, and the very fact that today parliament is basically dysfunctional, only one political force. The other forces refuse to enter. Again, one can question whether it was valid or not, to what extent they were right, but the fact is that today we have one party parliament with a certain majority, and the lack of meaning of political dialogue again and again. So I'm not a big fan of many opposition parties, and I can say that the part of the blame, part of the responsibility on them, but obviously whoever is in charge, the incumbents usually bear the bulk of the responsibility. Of course, there are many legitimate questions concerning the path of Georgian democratic trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving to a somehow related topic, how would the Istanbul Declaration, signed only by Georgia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan on the 8th of June 2026, mention Armenia by name, even though Armenia was neither a signatory nor present at the meeting in Istanbul?
I think the leaders of the three countries realize that it is a historic opportunity to take Armenia aboard, to make South Caucasus a fully fledged region, because it was not the case mostly because of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, the occupation of the Azerbaijani land. Now, when Azerbaijan restores territorial integrity, we see a very responsible approach and policy on the part of the current Armenian leadership, which fortunately won election and therefore renewed its mandate. We see that today there is a momentum, obviously, creating a significant region with very close ties with Turkey. We see also very responsible and, I would say, far-sighted and strategic attitude on the part of the Turkish leadership towards Armenia. There is a realization that there is a chance of making this region a very important hub, transportation hub, energy hub, and generally very important, I would say, gem on the map of bigger Eurasia, particularly given the very unstable situation to the south in Iran, the ongoing war that rages between Ukraine and Russia, and therefore South Caucasus has the potential of becoming the significant island of stability. And obviously, reaching this peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey, are very significant factors in this direction and this dream to be realized, so to speak.
Now also, regarding the Turkish foreign minister's reaction to the Armenian elections, what does that reaction tell us about the future trajectory of Turkish-Armenian relations, and what implications does it have in the context of the trilateral Istanbul Declaration, which also has a bearing on Armenia?
For several decades, the very fact that Armenian borders were closed, the longest borders were closed with Azerbaijan and Turkey, of course, it was isolating Armenia and making Armenia too dependent, uncomfortably dependent on Russia for pretty much everything, starting from security to economy. So therefore, now there is opportunity to break this vicious circle and include Armenia into the larger natural picture of this extended Caucasus region, whereby Turkey is also the important neighbor/member. So I believe that this statement on the part of the Turkish authorities also show that they want to see the situation improve. They want to herald a new era of the regional cooperation.
All right, so thank you very much for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, that's all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.